Intensity refers to the percentage of possible momentary muscular effort being exerted. Intensity refers to the percentage of possible momentary muscular effort being exerted. Now, to make that abstract idea more concretely clear, let me go to a concrete example. In fact, let's say you could curl 100 pounds for 10 reps. And no matter how hard you tried, you couldn't curl 100 pounds for 11. That 10th rep is your last possible rep. Now, the first rep of that set, of course, would be very easy. It would be the easiest, in fact, of all the reps of the set. Of all the reps of the set, in other words, the first rep would require the least percentage of your possible momentary muscular effort, the least intensity of effort. The first repetition fatigues you a little bit, of course, and therefore the second rep would require a greater effort, whereas the first rep may require 8 to 12% intensity of effort, 8 to 12% of your possible momentary muscular effort. The second rep may require on the order of 20%. The third rep fatigues you, or the second rep fatigues you even more, and the third rep will be experienced by you as harder still. And so it goes with each successive rep of the set. Each one is harder than the last. Each one requires a higher percentage of your possible momentary muscular effort than did the preceding, until finally we get to that last rep, the 10th one, where you're trying as hard as you can. That last rep is very special in that it's the only rep of the set that requires 100% intensity of effort, 100% of your possible momentary muscular ability. Now let me ask you a question. Which rep do you think would be more productive in terms of stimulating growth? The last rep, which is the hardest, or the first rep, which is the easiest? The last. If it was the first rep, then why do the last 9? Don't you think it stands to reason that the last rep would also be better than the second and the third? That last rep is, in fact, the stimulus, the trigger that sets the growth process into motion. Not the first rep, that's too easy. Bodybuilding is about effort. That's why we have adjustable barbells, so we can adjust the effort required and build strength and size. That last rep is very special. It's the only rep that requires 100% intensity of effort. Obviously, the last rep would be better than the first rep and also every other rep. So if you don't do that last rep, do you see where you're shortchanging yourself? That repetition, once again, is the only one that requires 100% intensity of effort. Now you see where the theory gets its name. That last rep is literally a trigger. There is something that goes on physiologically during that last rep which is responsible for flipping on the growth machinery inside the muscle cell. If you don't do that last rep, then you don't achieve maximum growth stimulation. And by the way, you can't make up for not doing it by doing several more haphazard sets. Either you trigger the growth process into motion, or you don't. It's that last rep, that's the trigger. If you don't do it, you can't make up for it by doing 3 or 4 or 20 more sets like that. Let me now give you quickly a formal statement of the first principle in case you want to study this later and think about it more for yourself. In order to stimulate an optimal increase in muscular strength or size, a set of an exercise must be carried to a point of momentary muscular failure, i.e. the exercise must be intense to stimulate growth. Now that you have that first principle, a question logically arises here. Okay, Mike Mentzer, you might be thinking to yourself, you did that pretty good, but going through that set and pointing out what intensity is in terms of percentage of effort, that last rep obviously would be the most productive. Now I want to know, Mike Mentzer, now that I have this first principle, I want to know exactly how many of those sets I should do for best results, and that is the correct question to ask here. Understand that science itself is an exact and exacting discipline. A proper science of bodybuilding, therefore, should tell you exactly how many sets to do. The Muscle Magazine people, of course, continue to advocate everybody do 12 to 20. That's not very exact. Is it 12 or is it 20? And if it's 12, who in the hell wants to do 20? And if more is really better, as they imply, then why not do 200 sets? Why stop at 20? Where did they ever get the number 20 anyway? It's literally arbitrary. Remember, science is an exacting discipline. There's no room for the arbitrary in science. Let me give you an example here. Let's go back to my favorite people, NASA at headquarters control right before a manned moon launch. The director yells down to the end of the control module, "Hey Fred, why don't you try throwing a blue switch this time instead of a red one? Let's see what happens." Not very likely they would succeed with their manned moon missions. Perhaps a more apt analogy here would be with medical science. If you were going to go into surgery tomorrow, very much want your anesthesiologist to give you the precise amount of anesthesia required. Any more than that, you could grow toxic and die. Take that same principle from medical science and apply it to exercise science. In both cases, we're dealing with a science, and in both cases, we're dealing with the human body. In the first case, the anesthesiologist is looking to infuse, the word is infuse, the human body with the precise amount of anesthesia required. In the second case, exercise science, we're looking to not infuse, but impose upon the body the requisite training stimulus and the proper, precise amount of exercise required. Even one set more than is required is overtraining. One of my favorite analogies here is within getting a suntan. You'll get a suntan every time you go out into the intense August sun, so long as you don't overexpose yourself. What happens when you expose your skin to even 1 minute more high-intensity ultraviolet sunlight in August than is required to get a suntan? You burn. That's all it takes. 1 extra minute. 1 minute in the sunlight, which is required minimally to get a suntan, you go into the negative, a sunburn. 1 set more even 1 set more than is minimally required to build up your muscles, you go into the negative, you lose muscle. Instead of overcompensating the body building something up, in the first case a suntan, melanin, the second case muscle tissue, the body goes into the negative towards decompensation. It loses skin, the skin burns, or in the second case you get weaker and smaller. Overtraining is not just something kind of negative. It's the single worst training mistake you can make. It is that precisely which militates against your achieving the desired result. And of course, the greater the overtraining, the more dire the consequences. It's possible to drive yourself into an overtraining situation so deep that it takes months to overcome. If you were to, in fact, get a sunburn, you wouldn't keep going out into the sun, would you? Because the sunburn would keep getting worse, would it not? Now, we don't have quite clear an alarm signal when we're overtraining in bodybuilding. I know of people who overtrain every day for months. They know nothing about this stuff. What they do amounts, in essence, to running to the newsstands each month, grabbing up a bundle of muscle magazines, running home, riffling through the pages at random, grabbing a program, let's say it's Gary Stridham's. Then they go into the gym and slavishly adhere to it for months and even years, during which time, of course, they make no progress, or very, very, very little, end up concluding, erroneously in many cases, that they have terrible genetics, they're hard gainers or no gainers, and they give up training entirely or continue going to the gym merely as a social function, a social ritual. In many of these cases, the individuals have great genetics. The point I'm making here is that without the proper methodology, you could literally have Mr. Olympia genetics and not know it. If a surgeon doesn't master the principles of surgery, he's not going to be as successful a surgeon as the guy who got all A's and was very disciplined and mastered the principles of surgery. What we need here is the specific, appropriate knowledge to achieve our goals. That man needs a method of cognition. Just as there are principles that guide us in training, there are principles that should guide us in our thinking. In fact, we wouldn't have any principles at all if it wasn't for Aristotle. He discovered the principles of thinking, those laws of logic. I made the point along the way a couple of times that if you think I'm sounding too professorial, people, or too intellectual, then you've got my best wishes, because this is what human life is about. Knowledge, learning how to think and use it. What we're looking for here is the precise, the least amount of exercise required. The logical place to start, even if you're skeptical, is with the least amount possible. The logical place to start is not with an arbitrary number like 20, but with the least amount possible. In other words, if one set doesn't work, you can't go any lower to find the least amount necessary. You can't do 0 sets and have a workout. If one set doesn't work, you could always go to 2. But I can save you the time and the headache. I've already worked it out. I've trained over 400 people, closer to 500 people now over the last 4.5 years. 1 set per exercise and never more than 2 sets per muscle is all that's needed. That's just the way it is. And if you're incredulous, you're skeptical, the reason for that is that you still have operative in your subconscious the childlike logic that more is better. In some cases, of course, that's true. More money is better than less. You can't take that principle and blindly apply it to exercise and expect to get anything out of it. 1 set per exercise, never more than 2 sets per muscle. Even if you're skeptical, that's the logical place to start. If you start out with 20 sets and that doesn't work, you're lost. Where do you go? Up to 21 or down to 19? If 1 set doesn't work, you can only go in the upward direction, and very methodically. You wouldn't go from 1 set to 15. We're looking for precision, the specific appropriate knowledge necessary.